My name is Claire Morgan, and for 14 years, my cousin Vanessa made a small ceremony out of humiliating me at every single holiday our family ever gathered for. It was never loud. Vanessa didn't do loud. She did it the way people who've never once had to fight for anything learn to do it, with a soft laugh, a raised eyebrow, and a comment dressed up so carefully as a compliment that you couldn't even call her out on it without sounding petty yourself. "Oh, Claire's here," she'd say, looking me up and down at the door with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, in her little thrift store find. "I love that about you, honestly. You just don't care what people think." Then she'd turn back to whoever was standing next to her, some new boyfriend or business associate or her mother's book club friend, and she'd say it again, softer, like a secret she was letting them in on. "Claire's the practical one in the family." Bless her. I heard some version of that sentence at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas Eve, every 4th of July barbecue, for 14 straight years, delivered with just enough warmth in her voice that anyone watching from the outside would have sworn Vanessa adored me. Only the people standing close enough to actually hear the words ever understood what she was doing. She was drawing a line, in public, at every single family gathering, with me standing permanently on the losing side of it. This past December, I stood in my aunt's dining room, the same dining room that had hosted that exact ritual for over a decade, and I listened to Vanessa tell her new sister-in-law, in that same soft, generous voice, that I was the one who never quite figured out what she wanted to do with her life, but we love her anyway, while the signed term sheet that made me the majority owner of her husband's failing design firm sat folded in my handbag, 6 feet away, close enough that I could have handed it to her before she'd even finished her sentence. I didn't hand it to her yet. Not right away. I let her finish. I had learned, a long time before that evening, that the exact moment you interrupt someone mid-performance is the moment you hand them back their power to spin the story, and I had absolutely no intention of giving Vanessa one more inch of narrative control after 14 years of watching her take all of it for free. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time, where the people quietly written off by their own families are so often the ones sitting on something nobody in that family bothered to ask about. If you've ever been the family's designated disappointment while secretly building something real, stay with me all the way to the end, because you already know exactly the particular tired I'm describing. And before we go any further, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we tell stories like this one every single week, and I promise you don't want to miss the next one. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly how a family builds a hierarchy like the one Vanessa and I grew up inside of, one small comparison at a time, long before either of us was old enough to have actually earned any of it. It doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with money, and with the particular way money quietly rearranges a family's sense of who matters, whether anybody involved ever says so out loud or not. Vanessa and I are the same age, 6 weeks apart, born into 2 branches of the same family that started out, by every account I've ever heard, roughly equal. Our mothers are sisters. My mother, Evelyn Morgan, married my father, a high school shop teacher named Thomas Morgan who spent 31 years teaching kids how to use a table saw safely and never once made more than $52,000 a year doing it. Vanessa's mother, my Aunt Margaret Harrington, married a man named Edward Harrington who started a commercial real estate brokerage out of a spare bedroom the same year Vanessa and I were born, and who spent the next decade turning that spare bedroom into a firm with 4 offices across 2 states. By the time Vanessa and I were in elementary school, the gap between our 2 households had already become the single organizing fact of our entire extended family's dynamic, the gravitational center everything else quietly orbited without anyone ever formally announcing it. Vanessa got a horse for her 10th birthday. I got a bicycle for mine, secondhand, repainted by my father in the garage the week before, and I remember being genuinely thrilled with it right up until Vanessa saw it at a family barbecue and asked, in front of 6 other kids, whether it used to belong to somebody else, because it still had a scuff on the seat that didn't look new. I was 10. I didn't have the language yet for what she was doing. I just knew that something about the way the other kids laughed made my face go hot, and that the feeling didn't go away for the rest of the afternoon. It would be easy, telling you this story, to make Vanessa into a cartoon, a mustache-twirling villain who woke up every morning plotting new ways to make her cousin feel small. That wouldn't be honest, and I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever told this story out loud, I'd tell it honestly, even the parts that don't flatter my own version of events. Vanessa wasn't cruel because she was evil. She was cruel because she was raised, from the earliest age either of us can remember, inside a family that measured worth almost entirely in visible success, and she had simply absorbed the lesson so completely that comparing herself favorably to me became less a choice and more a reflex, the same way you'd flinch away from something hot without deciding to. Uncle Edward used to say. At nearly every family gathering, some version of "you make your own luck," usually right after describing a deal he'd closed or a property he'd flipped, and I don't think he ever once noticed how that sentence landed on my father, who had made plenty of his own luck too, just in 31 years of a shop classroom instead of 4 commercial real estate offices, and who never once got asked about his work with the same admiring tone Edward's business always seemed to generate at those same tables. By the time Vanessa and I hit our teenage years, the pattern had fully calcified into something both families simply accepted as the natural order of things. Vanessa got a car for her 16th birthday, a real one, and I got a job at a drugstore so I could save up for my own, which took me almost 2 years of after-school shifts to afford. Vanessa went to a private college in New England that cost more per semester than my father made in 3 months, and I went to the state school 40 minutes from home, living at home for the first 2 years to save on room and board, working the drugstore counter on weekends the entire time. None of this, by itself, would have been enough to build the specific dynamic that defined our adult relationship. Plenty of cousins grow up with unequal resources and still manage to build something real with each other. What made ours different was the running commentary, the way Vanessa, every single time our families gathered, found some small, precise way to remind me and everyone else in the room exactly where the two of us stood relative to one another, delivered always with that same soft, generous-sounding voice that made it nearly impossible to name out loud as what it actually was. At my college graduation, which my parents attended with genuine, uncomplicated pride, Vanessa showed up late, missed the actual ceremony and told me afterward, at the small reception my mother had put together in our backyard, that she was so proud of me for sticking it out at a state school, because she knew some people found that kind of thing harder than others. At my first job, an entry-level position doing compliance work at a regional insurance company, Vanessa asked me, at that year's Thanksgiving, whether I thought I'd ever move into something more interesting, in a tone that made it clear she'd already decided the answer was no, regardless of what I said. I told her, honestly, that I liked the work, that I found the actual mechanics of risk assessment more interesting than most people expected, and she smiled the exact smile she'd smile at me for the next 12 years and said, of course. Someone's got to do the steady, reliable jobs. That's honestly so important. I have turned that sentence over in my head more times than I can count, in the years since, because it took me a long time to understand exactly why it hurt as much as it did. It wasn't an insult, technically. It was a verdict, delivered gently, about the entire shape of my future, handed down by someone who had never once asked me a single genuine question about what I actually wanted from my own life. There is one holiday in particular I still think about more than any of the others, the way you sometimes carry a single afternoon around for years after the rest of a decade has blurred together. It was a 4th of July, the summer I turned 26, at Uncle Edward's lake house, the kind of property that had its own dock and its own boathouse and its own carefully curated collection of relatives who understood, without being told, exactly how to behave around that kind of money. Vanessa had just closed on her first design showroom, and she spent most of that afternoon walking small clusters of family members through renderings on her phone, describing color palettes and client lists with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had learned to sell a room on herself before she'd ever learned to sell them on anything else. At one point, standing near the dock with a plate of watermelon in my hand, I made the mistake of mentioning, quietly, that I'd just gotten a modest raise at the insurance company, the first real promotion of my career. Vanessa turned to the small group around her, delighted, and said, "See, this is exactly what I mean about Claire. She's just so content with small wins." It's actually kind of beautiful, honestly, how little it takes to make her happy. Nobody in that group said anything unkind back to me directly. Nobody needed to. The sentence did all the work by itself, the way her sentences always did, and I remember standing on that dock afterward, alone for a few minutes, watching the water and understanding, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was going to spend the rest of my adult life either accepting that verdict or quietly, patiently proving it wrong, and that I did not yet know which one I actually had the resources to do. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. For a long time, I actually believed the verdict Vanessa kept handing down. Not because I lacked ambition, exactly, but because I had grown up in a household that genuinely valued steadiness over risk, stability over reach, and some part of me had quietly absorbed the idea that wanting more than a steady, reliable life was somehow a kind of vanity, the exact same way Vanessa's family had absorbed the opposite lesson without either family ever sitting down and deciding to teach it. I spent my 20s doing exactly what Vanessa expected me to do. I kept the compliance job. I got promoted twice, slowly, the unglamorous way, and I moved into a one-bedroom apartment I could comfortably afford instead of stretching for something nicer. Because stretching for things I couldn't comfortably afford was, in my family, considered a kind of moral failure rather than a kind of ambition. I watched Vanessa, over those same years, marry a man named Nathan Harrington, a charming, well-connected commercial developer's son who folded seamlessly into her family's world of country clubs and quarterly investor dinners, and I watched her launch a boutique interior design and staging firm with money from her father, the kind of firm that photographed beautifully for social media long before it had actually turned a real, sustainable profit. She invited me to the opening. I went, in the nicest dress I owned, and stood near the back of a room full of people who all seemed to already know each other, while Vanessa worked the crowd like she'd been born to it, which, in a sense, she had. Here is the part of this story I find myself needing to explain most carefully, because it's the part that changed everything, and it started so quietly that I almost didn't notice it happening to me at all. When I was 29, the regional insurance company I worked for got acquired by a larger firm, and as part of the transition, a small group of us in the compliance and risk division were offered an unusual opportunity, a chance to move into a newly created analytics team that was being built to help the larger company understand exactly the kind of risk exposure that had made their acquisition of us attractive in the first place. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with a title anyone at my family's holiday table would have recognized as impressive. But it put me, for the first time in my career, directly next to people who spent their entire professional lives thinking rigorously about how small, unnoticed patterns compound over long stretches of time into either catastrophic losses or extraordinary gains. And something about that framework rearranged the way I understood my own life almost immediately. I started reading everything I could find about long-term investing in my evenings, not because I had any money worth investing yet, but because the ideas themselves felt like the first genuinely exciting thing anyone had ever handed me about how the world actually worked underneath its surface. I opened my first brokerage account with $400 I'd been keeping in a regular savings account earning almost nothing, and I started, slowly and unglamorously, to learn. I never told Vanessa any of this. I never told most of my family any of this, honestly, because I had learned by then exactly how little interest they had in anything about my life that didn't fit the story they'd already agreed on, and because some private, protective instinct in me had started to understand that the less I said about my actual trajectory, the more room I had to let it grow without anyone's commentary shaping it. I kept showing up to holidays in the same modest clothes. I kept driving the same aging sedan long after I could have afforded something nicer, because a car, I had learned watching my own family for 30 years, is one of the fastest ways for people to form an opinion about you before you've said a single word. I let Vanessa keep calling me the practical one. I let her keep generously reminding the room where I stood. It cost me nothing to let her keep believing it, and it bought me something I didn't fully understand the value of yet, years and years of being underestimated by exactly the people who would eventually matter most to the story I'm telling you tonight. At 32, I made a decision that would have looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. I left the acquired insurance company for a much smaller, much less prestigious job at a boutique investment research firm downtown, taking a modest pay cut to do it, because the firm's founder, a sharp, unglamorous woman named Rebecca Lawson, had built her entire practice around exactly the kind of patient, unsexy, long-horizon thinking I'd fallen in love with reading on my own at night. Nobody in my family understood why I'd take a pay cut to work somewhere smaller and less impressive sounding than an insurance company. I didn't try very hard to explain it to them. Rebecca became, over the following 6 years, the single most important professional influence of my life, and working alongside her taught me things about patience, about reading a business's actual bones instead of its marketing, and about the specific discipline of staying quiet while everyone around you rushes toward the obvious, easy answer that no classroom or family holiday table could ever have taught me. And it was at that small, unglamorous firm, sitting in a conference room that smelled permanently of burnt coffee, that I first heard about a tiny and proven payments startup 2 junior analysts had found buried in an obscure filing, a company almost nobody serious was paying attention to yet, run by 2 engineers who understood something about small business cash flow that the larger, flashier competitors kept missing entirely. Rebecca used to tell me, during those years, that the hardest part of investing well had almost nothing to do with finding good opportunities and almost everything to do with tolerating the specific, quiet discomfort of doing nothing while a position either grew slowly or dipped in ways that made your stomach turn. She had a phrase she repeated often enough that I still hear it in her voice sometimes, years later, when I'm tempted to move too quickly on something. Patience isn't the absence of anxiety. It's just refusing to let the anxiety make your decisions for you. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I lived through it myself. Watching that first real position of mine sit underwater for the better part of 2 years while Vanessa's life kept accelerating visibly around me at every family gathering. There were nights during that stretch when I genuinely considered selling out of pure exhaustion, not because the underlying business had changed, but because I was tired of privately believing in something nobody around me could see any evidence of yet. What kept me from selling, more than any spreadsheet or analysis, was a kind of stubbornness I hadn't known I had until my late 20s, a refusal to let one more decision in my life be shaped by what would look reassuring to people who had never once asked me a real question about what I actually understood. If you're finding value in stories like this one, this is usually the point where I ask you to hit subscribe, and I mean it a little more than usual this time, because the next part of this story is the part one get the most questions about, and I don't want you to miss how any of it actually happened. I put $11,000 into that payment startup when I was 33 years old, which represented, at the time, nearly everything I had managed to save across 4 years of careful, unglamorous investing, plus a modest bonus Rebecca had insisted I take home in cash instead of reinvesting it back into the firm the way I usually did. $11,000 is not, by any measure, a fortune, and I want to be clear with you that I did not make that investment because I had some magical foresight nobody else possessed. I made it because I had spent 4 years training myself, deliberately and patiently, to recognize the specific signature of a business solving a real, unglamorous problem for people nobody else was paying close attention to, and because Rebecca had taught me that the biggest returns almost never come from the obvious, exciting story everyone else is already chasing. They come from the boring, overlooked one that turns out, years later, to have been the actual future all along. I told almost no one about that investment. I certainly didn't tell Vanessa, who at that point had begun expanding her design firm into a second, larger showroom, funded again by her father, and who had started referring to herself, at family gatherings, as building an empire, a phrase she used with just enough irony that you could never quite call her out for how seriously she actually meant it. The payments company grew slowly at first, the way real things almost always do. Nothing like the overnight story people imagine when they hear about someone getting wealthy from an early investment. For the first 2 years, my position was worth barely more than what I'd put in, and there were entire stretches where I genuinely wondered whether I'd simply made an expensive mistake dressed up as patience. I kept working at Rebecca's firm through all of it, kept living in the same modest apartment, kept showing up to holidays in clothes that told my family absolutely nothing new about where my life was actually headed. I remember a Christmas Eve during that stretch, my position down nearly 30% from where I'd bought in, sitting at my Aunt Margaret Harrington's table while Vanessa described, in loving detail, a kitchen renovation she and Nathan were doing on their new house, the kind of renovation that cost more than I'd made in my entire first 2 years out of college, and I remember feeling, for one uncomfortable moment, a flicker of doubt about whether the quiet, patient path I'd chosen was actually going to add up to anything at all, or whether I was simply going to spend my whole life being the practical one while Vanessa kept building the visible, glamorous version of success everyone in our family actually respected. It turned the corner in year 3, the way these things sometimes do, not with a single dramatic event but with a steady, compounding acceleration that felt almost anticlimactic when I look back on it now. The company landed a partnership with a much larger financial institution that gave it real distribution for the first time, and the growth that had been slow and uncertain suddenly stopped being either of those things. I didn't sell. Rebecca had spent years training me not to panic sell on the way down and not to greedily cash out too early on the way up, and by the time the company was acquired by a much larger fintech platform 4 years after I'd first invested, my original $11,000 had become, after taxes, just over $2.1 million. I remember sitting at my kitchen table the afternoon the acquisition closed and the funds actually settled into my account, staring at the number on my laptop screen for what felt like a very long time, feeling something considerably more complicated than simple joy. I felt, underneath the shock, a very specific and unfamiliar kind of anger, not at the money itself, but at the 14 years of being quietly, generously diminished by a family that had never once bothered to ask me a single real question about what I was actually building, because they'd already decided, long before any of it started, exactly who I was allowed to become. I did not immediately quit my job or buy a flashy car or tell a single member of my family what had happened. I stayed at Rebecca's firm for another 18 months, learning, deliberately, how to actually manage real capital instead of just growing it once by luck and patience, because I understood the difference between one good investment and an actual, repeatable discipline, and I wanted to build the second thing. Not just enjoy the first. I started making other investments with a portion of that money, still quietly, still without telling anyone, and one of the smaller, more speculative bets I made during that period was a modest position in a struggling boutique real estate and design holding company that a friend of Rebecca's was quietly assembling capital to acquire, a company whose largest single client, though I did not learn this until much later, happened to be a small interior design and staging firm run by a woman named Vanessa Harrington. I want to walk you through exactly how I found out, because I think the ordinariness of the moment is part of what made it feel so strange. I had, by that point, left Rebecca's firm and started my own small investment practice, modest by the standards of the real players in that world but genuinely mine, built entirely on the discipline Rebecca had spent 6 years teaching me and the track record I'd built proving I could repeat what had happened with that first $11,000 bet on purpose, not just by accident. One of the ways I found deals, in those early years of running my own practice, was through a small syndicate of other patient, unglamorous investors, people who specialized in exactly the kind of overlooked, undercapitalized small businesses that larger funds considered too tiny to bother with. A woman in that syndicate named Victoria Brooks reached out to me on a Tuesday afternoon about a struggling boutique design firm looking for a bridge investment to survive a genuinely brutal cash flow crunch, the kind that happens to design and staging businesses when a handful of large clients slow their payments at exactly the same time a firm's own overhead has grown too aggressively during better years. I read the diligence materials the way I read everything by then, carefully and without assumption, and I got about 6 pages into the financial summary before I saw it. In small type, under the section listing the company's founder and principal, Vanessa Harrington, née Whitfield. I sat with that document open on my laptop for a long time before I did anything at all. There is a version of that afternoon where I simply pass on the deal, quietly, citing some vague conflict of interest, and let Vanessa's firm find its rescue capital somewhere else entirely, never once revealing that I'd been the one who almost provided it. I actually drafted an email to Victoria doing exactly that before I ever sent it, sitting on it overnight because some part of me, even then, wasn't entirely sure which version of this story I actually wanted to tell. What changed my mind, in the end, wasn't some dramatic desire for revenge, though I won't pretend the thought never crossed my mind during those particular 24 hours. What changed my mind was reading, more carefully, exactly how much trouble Vanessa's firm was actually in, and understanding, with the specific professional clarity 6 years of training had given me, that without real capital and real operational discipline, that firm was going to fail within 18 months regardless of what I decided to do, and that 31 people currently employed there, most of them young designers and contractors who had nothing to do with the family dynamics I was busy sorting through in my own head, were going to lose their jobs as a direct result. I called Victoria back the next morning and told her the truth, that I had a personal family connection to the firm's founder, that I needed her to run the actual negotiation and diligence entirely at arm's length from me, and that if the numbers made sense on their own merits, entirely independent of anything to do with my family, I wanted to participate in the rescue capital as a limited investor in the broader syndicate vehicle, not as any kind of individual white knight riding in with strings attached. Victoria, to her enormous credit, took that seriously, the exact same way my own compliance instincts had trained me to take conflicts of interest seriously in every other part of my professional life by then. She structured the deal entirely on the merits of the business itself, real revenue, a genuinely talented design team, a client roster worth saving, and a founder in Vanessa who, whatever I personally thought of her, actually did have real creative talent and a real eye that had built something worth rescuing in the first place, buried underneath years of overspending and undisciplined growth that had nothing to do with the quality of her actual work. The deal took 4 months to close. I had zero role in negotiating the terms. I never spoke to Vanessa or Nathan once during the entire process, and the paperwork, when it finally closed, listed the investing entity only as a syndicate vehicle, the same generic, faceless kind of name that shows up on hundreds of small business financing deals every single year without anyone involved ever thinking twice about who exactly sits behind it. What the final structure gave me, once the ownership percentages settled out, was a 51% controlling stake in the holding company that now owned the majority of Vanessa's design firm, alongside a seat, should I ever choose to formally claim it, on the newly restructured board. I want to be honest about the several weeks between reading that diligence document and the deal actually closing, because it was not a period defined by any particular clarity on my part. I second-guessed the decision more times than I can count, running through every possible version of how it could go wrong, from Vanessa somehow discovering my involvement early and accusing me of engineering the entire crisis to punish her, to the far more mundane worry that I was simply making an emotionally complicated decision dressed up as a rational business one. I talked it through, carefully, with exactly one person outside the deal team, a longtime friend from Rebecca's old firm who had no connection to my family at all, and who asked me a single question that ended up settling the matter for me more than anything else: would you make this same investment, on these same terms, if the founder's last name meant nothing to you at all? I sat with that question for a long time, and the honest answer, once I actually let myself examine the numbers without any emotional noise attached to them, was yes, without hesitation, and that answer was the only permission I ultimately needed. Nathan found out first, the way these things sometimes happen, through an entirely unrelated conversation at an industry mixer where somebody mentioned my name in connection with the syndicate almost in passing, not realizing the connection meant anything at all. He called me directly, confused and a little embarrassed, to ask whether I was somehow related to the Claire Morgan listed on the closing documents his own accountant had just walked him through, and I told him the truth, plainly, the exact way I'd promised myself I would if this moment ever actually arrived. I told him I was his wife's cousin, that I'd had zero role in negotiating the deal itself, that Victoria had run the entire process independently, and that the only decision I'd personally made was choosing not to walk away from a legitimate rescue opportunity simply because of an old family dynamic that had nothing to do with whether the underlying business deserved to survive. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then he said something I've thought about often since, that he honestly didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified, because he had absolutely no idea how Vanessa was going to react once she found out, and neither, if I'm being completely honest with you, did I. If you've made it this far into the story, go ahead and tap that subscribe button now, because the family dinner where all of this finally came out is coming up next, and I promise you, it did not go the way anyone in that dining room expected. Nathan asked me, on that same phone call, whether I wanted him to tell Vanessa before the next family gathering or whether I'd rather do it myself, in my own way, on my own timeline, and I told him, after thinking about it for a full day, that I wanted to tell her myself. Not because I wanted the drama of a big reveal, though I'll admit some small, tired part of me, after 14 years of bless her hearts, did not entirely mind the idea of finally controlling the terms of a conversation Vanessa had spent over a decade controlling for both of us. I wanted to tell her myself because I understood, from my own professional life, that the person who breaks difficult news badly is usually the one who ends up carrying the blame for the news itself, regardless of whether the news was actually their fault, and I did not want Nathan, who had done nothing wrong in any of this, to be the one standing in the blast radius of his wife's reaction. I also wanted, honestly, to see her face when she finally understood, and I'm not going to dress that up as something nobler than what it actually was. I thought, for a while, about doing it privately instead, calling Vanessa and asking to meet somewhere quiet, just the two of us, so she could absorb the news without an audience watching her absorb it. I actually got as far as drafting a text message suggesting exactly that, and I sat with it, unsent, for the better part of a day, before I finally deleted it. Some part of me, the part that had spent 14 years watching Vanessa deliver her small verdicts about me specifically in front of an audience, understood that a private conversation would let the old story keep living quietly in every future family gathering, unwitnessed by the very people who had helped build it in the first place. I didn't want revenge, but I did want the truth to exist somewhere durable, somewhere the family's collective memory could actually hold on to it the same way it had held on to 14 years of bless her hearts, and the only way I knew how to make that happen was to let it happen in the room where all of it had started. I chose Christmas Eve, at my Aunt Margaret Harrington's house, the same dining room, the same table, the same 14 years of context, because I wanted the reveal to happen in the exact room where the dynamic had been built in the first place, brick by brick, holiday by holiday. I spent the weeks leading up to it doing something I want to be completely honest with you about, because I think it matters to how you understand the rest of this story. I did not spend those weeks plotting some elaborate performance. I spent them, mostly, working, running my small practice the same disciplined, patient way I'd run it for years, and trying to figure out, underneath all of it, what I actually wanted from Vanessa once the truth was finally sitting on the table between us. I did not want to humiliate her the way she had humiliated me. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would have been easy, and understandable, to want exactly that after 14 years. And I spent real time making sure that wasn't actually the thing I was walking into that dining room to do. What I wanted, as best I could articulate it to myself, was simply for the truth to finally exist in that room, out loud, where everyone could see it clearly, after so many years of a much smaller, meaner story being the only version anyone had ever been allowed to tell. I drove to my aunt's house that Christmas Eve in the same aging sedan I'd been driving for 9 years, because changing it now, on the exact night I intended to change everything else, would have felt like tipping my hand for no good reason at all. I wore a plain green sweater and jeans, nothing that would draw one single extra glance before I was ready for it to. I brought a pie, because that's what I'd brought to that dining room for a decade, and some habits, even on a night like that one, felt worth keeping simply because they were mine. The closing documents from the syndicate deal, along with a printed summary of my own investment practices' recent track record, sat folded inside my handbag, close enough to reach in under a second, the exact same way I imagine every person who has ever walked into a room carrying a truth nobody else knows yet has felt that particular, quiet weight against their side. Vanessa found me at the door within the first 5 minutes, the way she always did, greeting me with the same practiced warmth she'd been perfecting since we were children. "Claire," she said, pulling me into a brief, performative hug, "you look so cozy. I love that you never really change." She said it the way she always said things like that, with a smile bright enough to make the words sound generous to anyone not paying close attention, and I smiled back and told her it was good to see her too, and I let the moment pass exactly the way I had let a decade and a half of identical moments pass before it, because I had learned, by then, that the timing of a reveal matters almost as much as the reveal itself, and I was not going to waste mine on a comment at the front door. Dinner unfolded the way it always did, the same rotation of relatives, the same warm chaos of a full table, the same rhythm of conversation drifting from one branch of the family to another. Vanessa held court near the head of the table, describing, to a cluster of relatives leaning in with interest. How the design firm had come through what she called a genuinely scary cash crunch earlier that year, thanks to what she described as some really smart new investors who came in and believed in the vision when a lot of other people wouldn't have. She said it with real relief in her voice, and for one brief moment, watching her, I felt something unexpectedly close to sympathy, because I understood, in a way almost nobody else at that table could, exactly how frightening it is to watch something you've built teeter on the edge of collapsing entirely. It was Aunt Margaret Harrington, an hour into dinner, who finally handed me the exact opening I'd been quietly waiting for, without having any idea she was doing it. She turned to me, mid-conversation, with the same fond, faintly dismissive warmth she'd always aimed in my direction, and said, "And how's the practical life treating you, Claire? Still doing your little research job downtown?" Vanessa, beside her, laughed softly and added, "Claire's always been our steady one. Somebody's got to balance out the rest of us." I set my fork down, and I told them, as plainly and calmly as I could manage, that I'd actually left the research firm 2 years earlier to run my own investment practice, and that it had gone rather well. Vanessa's smile flickered, just slightly, the particular flicker of someone recalibrating a story in real time without yet understanding why they need to. "That's wonderful," she said, in the same generous tone she used for everything. "Good for you, really." And then, because I had decided, driving over that evening, that I was going to tell the whole truth in the plainest possible language rather than let this unfold as some slow, cruel game of reveal, I told her the rest of it directly. I told her that one of the deals my practice had participated in earlier that year, through a syndicate I invested alongside, was a rescue financing round for a struggling design and staging firm that had needed real capital to survive a difficult stretch. I told her I hadn't planned to say anything about it at all, that I'd genuinely debated staying silent, but that I didn't think it was right to sit at her family's table for another year pretending not to know something that significant about a business she'd built. And then I told her, as gently as I knew how to say something that large, that the firm was hers, and that the syndicate vehicle now holding a 51% controlling stake in her company's parent holding company was one I personally led. The table went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone present is doing rapid, silent math about what a piece of information actually means. Vanessa stared at me for a long moment, her fork still in her hand, and I watched something complicated move across her face, confusion first, then disbelief, and then, underneath both of those, something that looked almost like fear, the particular fear of realizing you've spent 14 years condescending to someone who now holds real, structural power over the thing you've spent your entire adult life building. "That's not funny," she finally said, quietly, and I told her I understood why it would feel that way, and that it also happened to be completely true, and that I had brought the closing documents with me if she wanted to see them for herself. I reached into my handbag, took out the folded papers, and set them on the table beside her plate, exactly the way I had imagined doing for weeks, though the reality of the moment felt considerably heavier than the imagining ever had. Nathan, sitting beside her, nodded quietly, confirming what I'd said before Vanessa had even finished reading the first page, and I watched her go still in a way I had genuinely never seen from her in over 3 decades of knowing her. "You've known this whole time," she said, not quite a question. I told her the truth, that I had known for a little over 4 months, that I had disclosed the family connection to my co-investor immediately and stepped back entirely from the negotiation, that I had zero role in setting the deal's terms, and that the rescue capital had been extended purely on the strength of her business and her team, not out of any personal feeling toward her whatsoever. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said, "and I didn't do it to help you either, honestly. I did it because the numbers made sense, and because 31 people who work for you were going to lose their jobs if somebody didn't step in, and it turned out I was in a position to be that somebody. What I want you to understand is that none of this changes what I actually think of how you've treated me for the last 14 years. It just means the story you've been telling about who I am finally has to catch up with who I actually became while you weren't paying attention." Aunt Margaret Harrington, visibly stunned, asked me gently whether I'd really left an insurance job to become some kind of investor, and I told her yes, 6 years ago, and that the specific investment that had made the rest of it possible had actually happened years before that, quietly, while I was still sitting at that exact table every single holiday being called the practical one. Vanessa didn't say anything else for a long stretch of the meal after that, and I want to be honest with you, watching her go quiet like that didn't feel as satisfying as some part of me had expected it to feel after 14 years of waiting. It mostly just felt sad, the particular sadness of watching someone realize, all at once, that the story they'd built their entire sense of superiority on had been resting on nothing more solid than the fact that nobody had ever bothered checking it. I want to be honest with you about what happened after that dinner, because I think false, tidy endings do this kind of story a real disservice. Vanessa and I did not hug it out at the dessert table. She left early that night, quiet and visibly shaken, and I did not hear from her directly for almost 3 weeks, though Nathan called me twice during that stretch, first to apologize on her behalf, which I told him he genuinely didn't need to do, and then, a week later, to ask, a little awkwardly, whether I'd be willing to sit down with both of them formally to talk through what the new ownership structure actually meant for the business going forward. I said yes, because I had meant what I told Vanessa at that table. I hadn't done any of this to hurt her, and now that the truth was finally out in the open, I had no interest in using my new leverage to punish her the way some tired, understandable part of me might once have wanted to. We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over from where either of us lived, neutral ground, 3 weeks after that Christmas Eve dinner. Vanessa looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, stripped of the performance she'd spent 30 years perfecting, and she said something to me across that table I genuinely hadn't expected to hear. "I think I've spent my whole life needing you to be the practical one," she said, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, "because it made me feel like the interesting one by comparison. If you were actually successful this whole time, quietly, without any of us knowing, 52412. Then I don't actually know what that says about the last 14 years of comparing myself to you." I told her I understood exactly what she meant, more than she probably realized, because I had spent a long stretch of my own life believing the very story she'd built about me, right up until I finally stopped. I told her the same thing I'd needed someone to tell me a long time earlier, that understanding where a pattern comes from doesn't erase the cost of living inside it for 14 years, but that it's still worth something, real something, to finally understand it plainly instead of just quietly resenting it forever. I did not take an active operating role in her business, and I told her clearly, in that same conversation, that I had no interest in becoming her boss in any meaningful day-to-day sense. What I did do, over the following year, was exactly what a disciplined, patient investor does with a struggling small business worth saving. I brought in an experienced operations consultant to help rebuild the firm's financial systems, insisted on a real, sustainable growth plan instead of the unsustainable expansion that had nearly sunk the company in the first place, and sat in on quarterly board meetings, formally, as the majority stakeholder, treating Vanessa's creative talent, which was genuinely real and genuinely good, with exactly the professional respect it had always deserved and had never actually gotten from anyone in her own family, including, if I'm honest, from me. During all those years I'd let her diminish me instead of ever pushing back. Nathan told me something, months later, over another one of those neutral coffee shop conversations, that stuck with me longer than almost anything else anyone said during that whole strange year. He thought it had actually been good for her, in a way he didn't fully know how to explain. "She spent her whole life being the person other people compare themselves to," he said. "I don't think she'd ever once had to sit across from someone she'd underestimated and watch that turn out to be a mistake. I think some part of her needed that, honestly, even if it was awful in the moment." I told him I understood what he meant, though I also told him, honestly, that I hadn't done any of it to teach Vanessa a lesson, and that I hoped he understood the difference between an outcome and an intention, because I had spent a long time in my own life being on the receiving end of people who confused the two. The firm stabilized within a year. It didn't become some overnight empire, but it became something sturdier and more honest than it had ever been under the old, undisciplined growth at any cost approach Edward's early money had trained Vanessa to believe was the only real measure of success. 31 jobs stayed intact. 2 new designers were hired the following spring, once the firm's cash flow had genuinely, sustainably recovered. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, something I genuinely hadn't expected began happening in small, quiet increments. Vanessa started asking me real questions, at family gatherings, about how I actually thought about risk and patience and the discipline of staying quiet while everyone around you rushes toward the obvious answer, the same questions I had wished, for 14 years, that a single person in that family would have ever thought to ask me. If this story has meant something to you so far, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because I've got a lot more stories just like this one, and I'd genuinely love for you to be here for the next one. The following Christmas Eve happened in the same dining room at Aunt Margaret Harrington's house, the same table, the same rotation of relatives settling into their usual seats out of a decade and a half of habit. I brought the same pie. I drove the same aging sedan, because at that point it genuinely wasn't a strategy anymore, just a car I liked well enough not to bother replacing. Vanessa introduced me to a new client of hers near the appetizer table within the first 20 minutes, and I watched her catch herself, mid-sentence, the old practiced words already halfway out of her mouth before she corrected course and said instead, "This is my cousin Claire. She runs her own investment practice, and honestly, she's the reason my business is still standing." It wasn't warm exactly, not in the effortless way family warmth is supposed to sound. There was still something unresolved underneath it, something 14 years doesn't unwind in a single season no matter how honest the conversations that follow turn out to be. But it was true, plainly and completely true, spoken out loud in front of people who mattered, and after 14 years of being called the practical one in that particular condescending tone, true was more than enough for me to build on. Nathan found me by the drink table later that evening and told me, without me having to ask, that the firm had just closed its best quarter in 3 years, and that 2 of the large clients who'd nearly walked away during the crisis the year before had not only stayed but referred new business since. Aunt Margaret Harrington, sitting near the fireplace with a cup of tea, caught my eye across the room at one point and simply nodded, a small, quiet acknowledgement that needed no further words attached to it, and I found that I didn't need any either. Vanessa found me near the end of the evening, once most of the other relatives had drifted toward the living room for coffee, and asked if she could sit with me for a few minutes on the back porch, away from the noise. It was cold out, the particular sharp, clean cold of a December night, and neither of us said much at first, just sat there watching our breath fog in the porch light. Eventually she told me that she'd started keeping a running list, privately, of every comment she could remember making to me over the years, the small ones she'd once believed were harmless, and that the list had gotten longer than she was comfortable admitting out loud. I told her she didn't owe me a full accounting of 14 years in a single sitting, that some things are better let go slowly, over real time, than forced into one tidy conversation just because a folder full of paperwork had finally made the truth impossible to ignore. She laughed, a little sadly, and said that sounded like exactly the kind of patient, practical thing the old version of her would have found unbearably boring, and that she was starting to understand, slowly, that boring and patient had apparently been building something the whole time nobody was watching closely enough to notice. I sat down eventually at the same table where 14 years of small, careful humiliations had been quietly delivered to me, my plate in front of me, the same room, the same faces, the same family that had spent over a decade handing me a story I never once agreed to but also never quite found the leverage to correct until I finally did. And sitting there, I understood something I wish I could hand directly to anyone who has ever been quietly written off by people who stopped paying attention to who they were actually becoming. The story other people tell about you only holds as much power as your own silence lends it. I let my family's version of me stand largely unchallenged for 14 years, not because I believed it, not anymore, but because I hadn't yet built the kind of life that made correcting it feel worth the cost of the conversation. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, reading 6 pages into a diligence document I almost didn't open at all, I finally did. If you've ever been the practical one, the steady one, the one your family quietly decided wasn't going anywhere interesting, I want you to type the word "seen" in the comments below, because I read every single one of them, and I promise you, your own version of that Tuesday afternoon might be closer than you think. And if this story reminded you of your own family, or someone else's, go ahead and share it with them, hit that subscribe button one more time for Calm Stories time, and I will see you in the very next one.